for Voices of Reason. My name is Steve Ulrich. Today we're joined by two of our regular panelists, Chris Borick from Muhlenberg College, Berwood, Yost from Franklin and Marshall College, two excellent pollsters who do a great deal of work surveying the citizens of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We wanted to talk today about the results from November 5th. We're taping this at 2 o'clock on Thursday, November 21st. So we're still going through the recount in the U.S. Senate race. But first of all, gentlemen, let's start with the presidential race. When you look at the final numbers in Pennsylvania, Donald Trump gets 50.38%, Kamala Harris 48.65%. Both of you were right on target when it came to the Democratic side of things, but just like a number of other pollsters, it seemed like there was an underestimate on Trump's support. Chris, I'll ask you first. Anything you were able to notice from delving into the numbers?
Yeah, that was, first of all, I think that's right. We've been looking at our numbers, doing lots of post-election analysis, looking at our breakouts versus exit poll data. Berwood and folks like us do lots of autopsies or postmortems, whatever you want to call after it. And you're right, Steve, this has been a pattern. Maybe more so for us this time than Berwood. I think Berwood's numbers were particularly strong in terms of this cycle. But we do our numbers for Casey, our numbers for Harris tended to be dead on, and that's part of measurement, by the way. There's a lot of ways to measure polls and the success, if you will, of a poll, and that itself is a little bit complex. But there was an under counting or under representation of President-elect Trump's final numbers, and that's been a pattern. That's been a pattern for us. It's been a pattern across many polls over these three elections that President Trump has been on the ballot. I could talk. I'll be interested to hear what Berwood has to say. Some of our methodological decisions that we used and made choices and are transparent about may not have been the best, in terms of our weighting for 2020 recalled vote and how we decided to do that compared to some different pollsters. But indeed, I think it was a good cycle, by the way, overall for pollsters. I'll make that case. I made it the day after, and I'll continue making it. But that undercounting still is an issue, at least in terms of President Trump's elections.
Or what were you able to find out from looking at your numbers?
Yeah, look, our numbers were actually pretty much spot on for the presidential race. We had it 50-49 among likely voters, and so we couldn't have done any better. So I mean, if that's your criterion for assessing the quality of the polls, I'd say it worked. I mean, we made some changes after 2020, particularly the way we asked the questions. So it was good. But I mean, the margins, if you look at all the polls in the last 3 weeks or so, I mean, they all showed a very close race, and it ended up being a very close race. I think much more importantly, and I've said this for years, the context and the way that polls help us understand the dynamics of an election are far more important to me than that one number. And you can go read what we wrote about the electoral environment prior to the election, but we started our final kind of analysis with a statement about how many headwinds Democrats were facing. The economy, ratings of Joe Biden's performance, personal finances. I mean, people were just not feeling good, and they were blaming Democrats because of Joe Biden. And so, I think the polls did a good job. They started to tell us that some traditionally Democratic groups were probably moving away this cycle because of those economic concerns. I mean, there was just a lot of information that polling provided. And the polls also told us it was going to be a close race, and it was. So I think the polls well done polls helped more than they hurt this cycle. I think they set the context just right. They helped us understand the dynamics. And they really, for me, this race was always about sort of the fundamentals that were really strongly against the party in power, and the belief among some people that perhaps things like January 6th, like abortion rights, that those kinds of non-contextual factors, but issue factors, character factors, would perhaps be enough to mitigate the context. In the end, they ended up not being that. But at least we knew from the polling that that was really what we were looking at.
Well, let me follow up on that. You talk about perhaps the Democrats' emphasis on defending democracy and extremism and reproductive rights just didn't seem to carry the day. When you look back on how you asked the questions before and what you saw in the exit polls after, do those mesh, or was that a bit of a surprise?
I think they meshed. I mean, we asked the question about what the most important problem was, but then when you asked the question about who was supporting which candidate, Trump had the advantage on economic concerns and immigration. Harris had the advantage on abortion rights and democracy and character, those kinds of things. And it was just how many voters would those issues be most important to? That's what it came down to. And there were more people who were driven by the economy, and that wasn't a surprise when you look at the indicators that we use to talk about financial distress. I mean, the numbers in terms of people who say they're worse off financially than they were a year ago, it was a devastating number. It was a devastating number for Democrats, and I'm not sure. Maybe we were a little too optimistic in some ways, because those numbers, when you look at the job approval rating of the president, you look at the personal favorability or the personal financial stuff, and compare that to past Octobers of election years, those numbers were as bad as you've seen for an incumbent party since 2008.
Chris, I saw some recent data that talked about late deciders and how they really seem to break for Donald Trump. Is that something that really kind of confounds pollsters? There's no way you can read into it and you're criticized because you're not able to anticipate the future that way?
Yeah, it always is problematic whenever you pull your poll, right? If you pull it a week out like we did, I think Berwood was a little bit earlier. You can't account for those changes, right? You can't capture those. I don't think there was an enormous amount this year, which I think leads to a bit of the stability of the polls and their ultimate good season. In my perspective, I concur with Berwood, but nonetheless, that little movement at the end could be impactful. There were other years. I'll go back to 2016. Berwood probably could talk about his experiences with that, and that's one particular year where I think a lot of the late movers and the exit polls showed what a percentage broke to Trump that year. That wasn't the only reason why Trump's vote might have been undercounted that cycle, but it certainly was a contributing factor. Yeah. And I'll just reiterate a couple of things that Berwood said from our poll. I've probably done 30 talks this year. And every talk that I started with talked with the things that Berwood was talking about, the cycle, right? I'm a political scientist. I'm teaching an elections class. My students were predicting the outcomes. We always start at the point, take the candidates out of the mix, take the strategies out of the mix, and then start with what should happen if all things fall to form. And they don't always fall to form. They're not determinative, but they're predictive. And that's part of this cycle. It was. I mean, the winds, if you will, the currents, whatever metaphor we want to use, were clearly blowing or flowing one way. And that can't be overstated. And then when you align it, as Berwood did, with the issue saliency and the difference, there was I said that there was degrees of magnitude when people were asking me about issues. They said, "Oh, reproductive rights." I go, "Yeah, it's absolutely a top tier issue. So is border security." But there was like 3 levels up before you got to inflation and the economy, and that, and and Trump wins overwhelmingly on that. And you combine it with Biden's low approval numbers, the challenges of any vice president following up a president, especially one with low approval numbers, and you kind of get a sense of where things were headed. All that being said, it was very close. It was very challenging. A lot of little things matter, but from a polling perspective, you start with those things.
Well, Berwood, let me ask you then, are we seeing a realignment of party coalitions? Because you have a lot of people talk about the Latino vote, for example, or a young male vote. Or is this really, are we going to look back years from now and just say, no, it was just the headwinds were going to be too strong? Incumbent vice presidents just don't often ascend to the presidency.
Yeah, well, look, we always make too much of the most recent election. It often takes time for patterns to emerge. Is there an emerging pattern that we've started to see in the past decade of a realignment along educational lines? Probably, or definitely. I won't say probably, definitely. And so, yes, maybe that's a continuation of the pattern, but we can't undersell sort of the context. I mean, if you look at every Western democracy over the last year or two, every one of them, the incumbent party, left or right, has taken a beating. And in fact, the Democrats' beating was the least painful in some ways, or the least decisive compared to many other countries. So there's just, we're still coming out of COVID. There's still dissatisfaction. Inflation is a killer for any incumbent party. I mean, if we take one lesson away, if I'm a politician, I'm taking that lesson away. Inflation's a killer. I got to do what I can not to see prices rise. But there's just a lot going on. It's too soon, in my estimation, to say that we've got a new coalition. Issues matter, context matters. There's always a group of voters that are going to be, moving from one party to the next. It's a smaller group than it used to be, but they still exist. And I think what we really should prepare ourselves for is that now and for the next few cycles, I think we're just in a competitive environment where either side might win because the divisions are so narrow. I also want to say one other thing I was thinking about while Chris was talking, and that is, I think part of my hesitation when I did my 30 talks, like Chris did his, I was out talking to people about the same things, and I always start with the fundamentals. And I said, but one thing we don't know is the issue set. And 2022 may have distracted us. I think for me, seeing what happened in 2022, which was so against the norm, really the fundamentals in 2022 called for a big Democratic loss as well, and it didn't happen. And we thought, oh, it's probably the whole things about democracy and abortion rights that has changed how much the fundamentals matter. That seemed to be one of the lessons of 2022, perhaps. Now you look back and you say, well, maybe in a midterm, but boy, it sure wasn't the case this time. And so again, we continue to learn and adapt and see what happens from election to election. But let's not jump to any conclusions, because these patterns work themselves out over many cycles, not one.
Chris, your thoughts on the same topic?
Yeah, Steve, I think it's a great question, first of all, and Berwood's right. Since over the last 10 years, we've seen a realignment to a large degree across those educational divides, right? With the Democratic Party picking up higher educated folks, Republican picking up working class whites, and to a degree this time, advances among voters of color from the working class in particular. But I think where we look at this particular election and say, is this a realigning election? It might be part of an era of elections that are doing some realignment. But the big picture, and this Berwood touches on this in the international comparative experience where the U.S. stands, is look, the gains that Trump made Republicans gain this time were incremental, marginal across almost every demographic. And that lends, at least to me, evidence about the broader environmental impacts. If you look at, like, the New York Times has these maps with little arrows going, and and how big they were from last time, and there are lots of little arrows everywhere, right? You look at the exit polls, you see the same thing, you can compare them, and all those things, in my mind, speak to a couple of things that Berwood said, and I think were overwhelming. We're in a dour mood as a country. People are not happy. They sense kind of a bad direction for things. That's absolutely tied to our experiences with the pandemic. That's a traumatic event for the country, for lots of people. You don't just fly out of that feeling great. You align that with inflation. And I say this, I look at you two and I say, well, maybe you lived a little bit through inflation back late 70s and 80s, but a lot of other Americans never have experienced inflation, not once. And that is sobering when your buying patterns are changed, your ability to buy houses, ability to buy cars is altered. That's a central tenet of our lives. And that affects everybody. Of course, lower income folks maybe more than anybody else. But the reality is, when those things hit you, there's a lasting effect. And you can make all the cases you want in the world about positive macroeconomic indicators, and they're real in the US and in Pennsylvania. But you can't sell people when they feel something. And that's, to me, that's the story, right? That's the story in this cycle. And so the Democrats often make the mistake. I think they have that demography is destiny. And that as the population becomes more diverse, larger Latino population, larger voters of color, they were going to win, handily. That's not right. And we saw that inch back this time. By the way, Republicans should not immediately say, "Oh, okay, we've now made incredible gains among Latinos and marginal gains among Black voters. We can count on that in the next cycle." Because, hey, guess what? The next cycle might not be your cycle. And those things bounce back.
No, I will give it away. The white hair does indicate that I remember the win button that Gerald Ford handed out, the whip inflation now. So, yeah, that's now out there for posterity. Let's talk a little bit about the down ballot races and how the presidential race may have impacted the U.S. Senate race. As we said, as of this recording, Dave McCormick with a 0.25 percentage point lead over U.S. Senator Bob Casey in a recount that most likely is not going to change the outcome. But Berwood, I want to start with you. Did you see anything from the exit polls that led you to see why perhaps McCormick was able? Was it all coattails, or was there something more that seemed to bring him across the finish line?
So I haven't looked at the exit polls about that in PA really, because the data for me exists in the vote totals. So one thing that is clear is that fewer people voted in the Senate race than in the presidential race. It was about a 1% drop. So that's not unusual. Back in 2012, when Casey ran in the presidential cycle, it was about 98% of the votes cast for Senate for proportional to the president. So that drop off, that roll off, that undervote, whatever term you like to use, wasn't out of the norm, but it was out of the norm in some places. In Philadelphia, that drop off was about 5%. And if you look in Philadelphia alone, I'm talking one county, right? Bob Casey ran behind Kamala Harris by 26,000 votes. That's the story. You can look around Philadelphia in the southeast at the those collar counties, Chester, Bucks, Montgomery, Delaware. The roll off there was about 2%, double the state average, and Casey ran 17,000 votes behind Harris there. The question for me is why? Particularly in Philadelphia, why did Casey have so much trouble getting those voters who supported Harris to vote for him. In 2012, I referenced that before. He ran ahead of Barack Obama in this state. He was about 1.5, 2 points higher in his race against Tom Smith. So this time, a well-known brand in Pennsylvania politics ran behind the top of the ticket, and he ran behind her in specific places where he should have done better. To me, that's where I'm going to be looking over the next few weeks to see if any of those, see what was happening there.
Chris, I know Dave McCormick spent a lot of time in your neck of the woods, Lehigh Valley, up in Missouri and Lackawanna, trying to cut into some of the margins. And from what we can tell, it seems like he was successful with that strategy.
Yeah, he was. He was. And that's, I love Berwood's analysis and kind of Casey-centric, but we'll have to flip it a little bit, right? In those many talks that Berwood and I were given, I structured them for the combination of cycle and candidate was going to be the hardest matchup for Casey. Casey had the privilege of running in some pretty good cycles. 2006, an extraordinarily good cycle. 2012, a decent cycle. 2018, another good cycle. This cycle was by far the hardest. And I think you could make, candidate comparisons across time and space is never easy, but I would say McCormick was the best. He had liabilities, of course, we know that, residency and some of his background work in hedge funds probably weren't the best thing you want to be rolling out in an election. But apart from that, he's a solid candidate, right? I called him the Goldilocks candidate in a lot of my talks from a Republican perspective. He kind of appeals with his military background, his West Point background, his business background to more moderate Republicans, kind of traditional Republicans, but he doesn't draw the ire of the ascending MAGA movement, the populace, right? I didn't get called Rhino a lot. Maybe a little bit of that is, like coming out of 2022, didn't bite too hard for recounts and things. And so he left a little bit of goodwill. Ran a solid campaign, was well financed, as you said, targeted some areas that he just had to do well on the margins with comparatively, and he did, right? And then you combine that with what Berwood said in that drop off. I'm absolutely sure. Again, I don't talk to people in the Casey campaign, but that's probably where they were just at the end of the day. Those Southeast Philly drop off numbers had to have I would imagine, caught them a bit by surprise. They knew how tight a race it was. All the evidence pointed to that, but that their ability to kind of sustain a potential Harris loss and still win just wasn't enough.
One of the things that we do at Politics PA, we had our own little poll tracker, and we've talked to the two of you about just the trend line, see what you can see along the way. And I had a fellow journalist that screenshotted our poll tracker and showed the entire Casey McCormick race, all 55 polls indicating that Bob Casey was in the lead. Is this what you call, Berwood, an upset, or is this truly a margin of error situation?
Again, I think our final poll showed Casey up by 1. It's a coin flip. There is no poll in the world that's precise enough, even really to discern, a 2-point margin consistently, or 3. The closer a race is, the less effective our toolbox is, because we're just not that precise. And so, look, very few polls showed McCormick with an advantage, but I think, as we pointed out, there's strong recent evidence that the top of the ticket, whoever wins at the top, is going to drag the Senate candidate with them. That's been the recent history, and that's not a surprise. And I think our own data, and I'm sure Chris's data, just showed how the race narrowed from August, where Casey had a clear advantage. It started tightening in September. By our October poll, now we finished, I think it was 19 days before the election was when we came out of the field. But by that point, you could see the race tightening. And that's just, I mean, part of that is what Chris said. I think that McCormick was the most formidable candidate that Casey has run against. And this was also the most difficult election cycle for him in terms of the fundamentals, which we've talked about earlier. It's just it was going to be a tough cycle for all Democrats. And I think he ran a campaign that made sense, that being Casey. I think McCormick did as well. And McCormick had something that most of his other challengers didn't have, basically unlimited money. So he could get his message across. And if there was a thread I'm interested in, and want to think about some more, it's the fact that I think Casey did what he could do to separate himself from the Biden administration and from Harris from the top of the ticket. McCormick did all he could do to tie him to Biden and Harris. And in the end, I think that was the tension that probably led to his defeat. I don't know. I mean, the race was so close, any little thing could have mattered. But I am sure he's just wondering, what could I have done to get those 26,000 votes? Or, give me half of them. That gets me pretty close to where I need to be in Philadelphia.
Chris, let me ask you, along with what Berwood just said, is that what may have cost Susan Wild and Matt Cartwright their seats in the 7th and 8th congressional districts?
Yeah, absolutely. They're 1 point, 2 point races, right? And the Casey one's even closer. And those if people say, all right, did Trump have any coattails? We don't talk a lot about coattails these days. You needed a really tiny coat, right, to just jump on for those candidates, the Bresnahans or McKinsey or McCormick. You didn't need a gigantic boost, right? You just had to have a little bit, and you get a little bit, right, in terms of Trump's margin. And in the end of the day, I like Berwood's point. Like Casey, who you looked at, he was going to have trouble breaking free of a connection to Biden because it's a real connection. I mean, they grew up in the same neighborhood. I grew up a couple miles away from him. It's Greenridge, Pennsylvania. They're Irish Catholic, kind of same brand of politics. It was going to be hard for Bob Casey to really distance himself. And in the cycle, right? The cycle was just that inflationary thing. I think Casey, I was asked a lot about this. He tried to get ahead of that with his greedflation angle and try to target that. And I think it was a good strategy, but it can only take you so far when people feel a certain way. And so, yeah. By the way, one last thing about the polling in the Casey race. As you said, well, he wasn't in the lead. In polls, but as Berwood alluded to, the trend lines were clearly headed in one direction. And then you get that movement at the end, those little things, if there's momentum, that doesn't, people would say, oh, that's a bad polling season. I'd say, no, it told you where this thing was headed. It told you it was really close. It's crazy close, right? I mean, those are the thing that Berwood mentioned. If you're saying Casey's up by 1, and he loses by a couple thousand votes, that's a great polling cycle in my mind.
It is.
Well, let me ask you both about the 10th congressional race. I think a lot of people thought that this was a cycle that Representative Scott Perry would lose his seat to former broadcast journalist Janelle Stelson, but that didn't happen. So I'm left to think that in central Pennsylvania, we may be seeing a subtle shift to the left, but in the end, Cumberland, Dauphin, and York counties are still as red as they can be, Berwood?
Hey, look, we could copy Chris's response for the 7th and 8th and enter it here, right? I mean, this is the same thing. Stelson, I thought, ran an effective campaign, but I always thought that a multi-term incumbent who knows how to campaign in his district is going to be in okay shape. Like, it was still his race to lose. And it was narrow, but that is still a Republican leaning district. And maybe 2022, it's a different outcome if the same race is run. If Stelson runs against him with the same resources, the same energy in 2022, perhaps she wins that race because the electorate is different. And that's something we haven't really talked about, but I got some flack about likely voters in our final poll because there was a difference between our likely voter models and our registered voter models. And we basically said, look, what the electorate looks like matters. When we moved to likely voters from registered voters, there are more Republicans, less moderates, less young voters, all groups that Democrats did better with. And so, those likely voter numbers turned out to be pretty darn good. And it was because of the composition of the electorate. And so when we talk about 2024 versus 2022, two different electorates with different, made up in different ways, and particularly different in terms of their ideological and partisan makeup. And that's a big story of the 2024 election, who showed up and who didn't. That's something else we'll have to dig into.
We'll get you guys out of here on this one. 2.5 weeks after the general election, Chris, what will we write about years from now about the 2024 election?
It'll be interesting because it'll be in conversation with the other Trump elections in 2020, right? That's how we look at cycles and periods in American politics, Steve. And I've been describing the election as this is an unquestionably great year for Republicans that followed what I would argue, and Berwood talked about, a traditional pattern in American politics. Donald Trump always adds his own twist to those things, but he still rides cycles, right? And things that we look at. And so I would think that is important. The thing I would say about the Republican victories, and we'll of course make them out to be, the former President Trump will say historic, the biggest, the best ever. They were wide. If it's a sea of red, it's a shallow sea. It's a shallow sea. It's not that deep. And if you read into it and say, oh, okay, well, look at this is clearly, where we've changed. A shallow sea based on a good cycle might be misread in terms of where Americans are at. And I think that's a potential as we go back and look at this, especially over time.
Berwood, same question.
It's interesting that the way Chris refers to it, because I've been telling people this wasn't a wave, it was a heavy rain. And it moved things in a certain way, but it has, it really wasn't overwhelming. If it were overwhelming, you wouldn't have a Democratic state house, for instance. You wouldn't have had a race decided by a quarter of a point in the Senate race, or by, pick your races. So, it is just, to me, what has become par for the course in this state and nationally, that we are in a period of intense partisan competition, and that's going to continue. So I think 2024, the story of 2024 gets back to, the importance of the fundamentals in any election campaign, the advantages that Republicans had, and a discussion to see if the sort of movement among working class voters in this educational divide persists, or is pushed back a little bit in coming elections. We'll see.
Our two favorite pollsters, Berwood Yost from Franklin and Marshall College, Chris Borick from Muhlenberg College. Thank you so much for joining us today on Voices of Reason.
Thanks, Steve.